Human history is basically a long list of fights we were lucky to survive. From mushroom clouds over Japan to plagues carried by armies, some of these wars devastated continents. Others almost dragged the planet into extinction. The mere fact that we're still here talking about it means humanity got very, very lucky. Now, before I begin, if this kind of original content grabs you, do me a favor, hit like, subscribe, share, ring that notification bell, comment. It is all the best way to keep this channel going. With that being said, I'm Mike with List 25, and these are 25 wars that almost wiped out humanity. 25. The Cold War. The Cold War was the longest standoff in modern history, stretching from the late 40s to the early 90s. On one side, we had the United States. On the other, the Soviet Union, and both were armed with weapons that could have ended the world in an afternoon. It was called cold only because the two never fought each other directly, but every strategy and every move came with the risk of nuclear exchange. The most dangerous moment came in October 1962. Soviet missiles had been placed in Cuba, just 90 miles from the US, and for 13 days, the two sides stood on the edge of nuclear war. Leaders were making minute-by-minute decisions, while the ordinary people wondered if we'd finally reached the end. Disaster was ultimately avoided, but not by much. The Cold War ended with the collapse of the Soviet Union, but it left us all with the very grim realization that the end of the world is always just a few buttons away. 24. World War II. World War II kicked off in 1939 when Hitler invaded Poland. Britain and France declared war, and before long, almost the entire world was pulled in. The Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan, went head-to-head with the Allies led by the US, the Soviet Union, Britain, and China. The war was fought everywhere. In Asia and the Pacific, Japan's empire clashed with Allied forces from Burma to Iwo Jima. Europe, battles like Stalingrad chewed through over 1 million soldiers, while the Normandy invasions left hundreds of thousands dead or wounded. But the civilian toll was even higher. The Holocaust murdered millions of people in death camps, while mass bombings and famine destroyed entire populations. By the time the war ended in 1945, the first atomic weapons had been used, Germany was flattened, and somewhere between 70 and 85 million people were dead. 23. The Russia-Ukraine War. We've all been watching the war in Ukraine unfold. I mean, it's kind of hard to miss. But ask most people how it really started or what's hanging in the balance, and you'll probably get a shrug. It started in 2014 when Ukraine's pro-Russian president was ousted and Moscow moved in to seize Crimea. Soon after that, fighting broke out in the east, and by the time a shaky front settled in, more than 13,000 people had already been killed. Everything escalated by February 24, 2022, when Russia decided to launch a full-scale invasion. Ukraine pushed back, and with Western weapons flowing in, managed to stop Russia from taking the capital. Since then, the war has dragged into a grinding stalemate. But that doesn't mean it's over. Russia still holds about 19 to 20% of Ukraine's territory, and Ukrainian counteroffensives seem to be getting nowhere. Every so often, peace talks do come up, but Russia keeps demanding recognition of Crimea and its new territories, and Ukraine refuses to sign that away. At the same time, Ukraine has carried out drone strikes inside Russia and raids across the border, so the war hasn't stayed contained on one side. But it needs to be said that this war isn't only about land. The actions are reshaping the world's food markets, messing with Europe's security, and making nuclear threats part of everyday politics again. 22. The Korean War. In 1950, North Korea stormed across the 38th parallel and almost captured the South. Backed by Moscow, Kim Il-sung believed that the US wouldn't step in. He was wrong. The United States led a UN force to defend South Korea, and within months, the battle line stretched across the whole peninsula. The balance of the war shifted repeatedly, so much so that Seoul changed hands 4 times. But what made it terrifying for the rest of the world was how close it came to turning nuclear. US General Douglas MacArthur actually asked for permission to use atomic bombs on Chinese and North Korean forces. President Truman refused, But if those weapons had been used, the Soviet Union would have probably responded. When a ceasefire finally stopped the conflict in 1953, 3 million people were dead, and Korea was split in two. 21. World War I. More than 15 million people died in World War I, and that's being conservative. France ended up full of trenches where machine guns, poison gas, and artillery became the norm. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers fell in single campaigns like the Somme and Verdun, and their efforts barely moved the front line. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand triggered the unrest, but his death was actually only the excuse. Europe's web of alliances guaranteed that Austria-Hungary moved on Serbia, Russia mobilized to protect it, Germany declared war, and soon, half the world was involved. By 1918, four empires were gone, Europe was shattered, and generations had been lost. Add to that a deadly global flu carried home by returning soldiers, and it's a wonder we made it through it all. 20. The Mongol Invasions. Genghis Khan pulled the tribes together in 1206, and from there, the Mongols didn't stop. They moved so fast and hit so hard that whole empires simply disappeared. When they rolled into Khwarazm, the cities were burned and the population was murdered. Baghdad, once the jewel of the Islamic world, was destroyed in 1258. Kiev? Flattened. If a city resisted, it was destroyed. Their empire eventually stretched from China to Eastern Europe, the largest land empire in our history. Somewhere between 20 and 60 million were killed, about 1 in every 10 people on Earth at the time. It was mass death on a level the world wouldn't see again until the outbreak of the World Wars. 19. The Three Kingdoms War. When the Han Dynasty fell in 220, China fractured into three rival kingdoms, Wei, Shu, and Wu. For the next 60 years, those states fought to control the country. The cost was catastrophic. Farmland was abandoned, cities turned into ruins, and provinces were laid bare. The ensuing famine and forced conscription made life impossible for millions. Now, you should remember at that time China was the most populous society on Earth, a hub of farming, trade, and culture. So when it splintered, that shock carried global weight. The Jin dynasty eventually brought the kingdoms back under one rule in 280, but by then, millions of people, close to 1 in 6 alive at the time, were dead. A lot of humanity's shared memory and culture were lost, and much of it for good. 18. The An Lushan Rebellion. China shows up on this list a lot, but that's because the place was so massive that when things went wrong, they went spectacularly wrong. Before the An Lushan Rebellion, the Tang Dynasty recorded about 52 million people in the country. When the dust settled, the rolls showed just 17 million. Some fled, some were enslaved, but millions were simply gone. The rebellion started in 755 when General An Lushan decided he could do things better and launched a coup that sent the Tang court running for their lives. Cities were taken, lost, and taken again. Tang loyalists eventually clawed their way back to power with Uyghur help, but the rebellion shattered the idea that the dynasty was untouchable. From that moment on, China's golden age was living on borrowed time. 17. Timur's Conquests. Timur, better known in the West as Tamerlane, had a calling card: piles of skulls. After his armies sacked cities from Persia to India, they'd stack the remains of the dead into towers as a warning to anyone thinking of resisting. And people resisted anyway, which meant more towers. From 1369 to 1405, he cut his way across Persia, Central Asia, and the Caucasus, and into India and the Middle East. Delhi was sacked in 1398, leaving tens of thousands dead. Baghdad, which had already been destroyed by the Mongols in 1258, was crushed again in 1401. Its people slaughtered, and its ruins turned into another field of skulls. Even the Ottomans felt his reach when he captured their sultan, Bayezid I, at Ankara. After Timur's death, somewhere between 7 and 17 million people had been killed, and most of the cities he destroyed never regained their former strength. 16. The 30 Years' War. The 30 Years' War was fought as much by mercenaries as by kings, and that's why it was so destructive. Armies didn't just battle each other. They lived off the land, which meant robbing civilians, torching villages, and leaving famine behind them. It began in 1618 as a religious showdown, when the Protestant nobles in Prague rebelled against the Catholic emperor. It should have been a local fight over faith, but it spiraled outward as Sweden, France, Spain, and the other powers joined in. The conflict lasted 3 decades and killed 4.5 to 8 million people. In some German states, half the population was gone. It took generations for towns, farms, and economies to recover, and the shock was so deep that the Peace of Westphalia in 1648 basically rewrote the rules of Europe. The idea of state sovereignty and non-interference, basically that each state could do whatever it saw fit, came straight out of that bloodbath. 15. The Second Congo War. Most of the roughly 4 million people who died in the Second Congo War didn't die in combat. They died of disease and starvation after their homes were burned, farms were abandoned, and the country's health system collapsed. Malaria, cholera, and hunger cut down millions of people, especially children, while the armies just kept on fighting. The conflict, which started when rebels in the east backed by Rwanda and Uganda rose against Laurent Kabila's government, ended up being called Africa's World War. Kabila pulled in his allies like Zimbabwe and Angola, and 7 countries engaged in combat on Congolese soil. While all of that was going on, militias and warlords kept chasing Congo's minerals, and the result was destruction on such a scale that whole regions were left in ruins. Congo's east never fully recovered. The war gutted the country's infrastructure, stripped away the last bit of trust between communities, and left the Congo stuck in a cycle of violence and instability that continues to this day. 14. The Napoleonic Wars. The Napoleonic Wars traumatized Europe permanently. The Holy Roman Empire was dissolved. The Congress of Vienna redrew the borders, and Napoleon's legal code spread far beyond France. You would even see people taking up new ideas of nationalism after living under French rule, so it basically set up the continent's politics for the next 100 years. But it all came at a massive cost. From 1792 to 1815, Europe was practically always fighting, and the death toll was horrific. Between 4 and 7 million people were killed, soldiers and civilians. Napoleon would finally be defeated at Waterloo, as most of you already know, but by then, the continent was more or less exhausted. 13. The 100 Years' War. The 100 Years' War stretched on for so long that people were born, lived, and died without ever knowing a world at peace. England and France fought over the French crown, and while the battles came and went in waves, the devastation never really stopped. Longbowmen crushed knights at palaces like Hestie and Agincourt, while Joan of Arc's rise gave France a sudden surge of morale that turned the tide. When the French finally pushed the English out in 1453, both kingdoms were battered. France came out stronger with a monarchy that would dominate for centuries, while England limped into its own civil wars and eventually turned its aspirations overseas. 12. The Mughal Maratha Wars. In the late 1600s, the Mughal Empire, one of the biggest and richest powers in the world, ruled India. Its emperor, Aurangzeb, was determined to get rid of a rising Hindu force called the Marathas, who wanted their own independence. What followed was 3 decades of war, sieges, guerrilla raids, executions, and endless campaigns that drained both sides. The Mughals had the numbers, but the Marathas had local support, and year after year the empire bled resources it couldn't replace. In 1707, when Aurangzeb died, the Mughal Empire was crumbling, while the Marathas were expanding. Their decline created a vacuum that gave the British East India Company its opening, so their demise became one of the steps that ultimately handed India over to colonial rule. 11. The Russian Civil War. If you've been following our channel for a while, you've probably heard me talk about Russia's last royal family. Most people know more about the mystery of Anastasia or the imposters who claimed to be her than about the war that actually swallowed the whole country. When the royal family met their end in 1918, Russia fell into chaos. There were the Bolsheviks under Lenin, promising peace, land, and bread, and the so-called white armies, a mix of monarchists, moderates, and anyone who hated communists. The fight pulled Britain, France, and even the US into the mix, and the scale of it became brutal. The Red Army under Trotsky swelled to millions, far outnumbering the whites, and battles, famine, and epidemics killed millions. After the Reds took Vladivostok in 1922, the war had cost 7 to 12 million lives. The result wasn't just a new government, it was the birth of the Soviet Union and the beginning of a system that would dominate the 20th century. 10. Chinese Civil War. Every time Taiwan and Beijing square off today, you are seeing the aftershocks of a war that never technically ended. The Chinese Civil War left two rival governments both claiming to rule all of China, Mao Zedong's communists on the mainland and Jiang Jiexi's nationalists in Taiwan. That split hardened into one of the biggest flashpoints of the Cold War, and it's still with us now. The roots go back to 1927, when the fragile alliance between the nationalists and the communists collapsed in violence. They paused their feud to fight Japan, but once World War II was over, the rivalry turned into a full-scale contest for the country. The Soviets armed the communists in Manchuria, while the US backed Jiang, but corruption and runaway inflation hollowed out nationalist support. By 1949, the communists had taken Beijing, Mao declared the People's Republic, and Jiang fled with soldiers, treasures, and millions of refugees. 9. The Vietnam War. In 1968, during the Tet Lunar New Year, communist fighters hit more than 100 cities and towns across South Vietnam at once. The shock wasn't that they held ground, but that Americans watching at home realized the war was nowhere near being won. Support collapsed almost overnight. The Vietnam War had been grinding on since the 50s. Washington pushed the domino theory hard, saying if Vietnam fell, the rest of Southeast Asia might follow. That logic poured American troops, bombs, and chemicals into the fight. Vietnam ended up being bombed more than any country in history. Over 5 million tons of explosives hit Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, twice what the US dropped on all of Europe in World War II. North Vietnam and the Viet Cong, on the other hand, fought with guerrilla tactics, relying on jungles and tunnels to keep the pressure on until the US was worn down. By 1975, Saigon had fallen, and Vietnam was reunified under communism. The United States had to leave Vietnam with more than 58,000 dead and nothing to show for it. 8. The Soviet-Afghan War. On Christmas Eve 1979, Soviet paratroopers dropped into Kabul and other Afghan cities while armored divisions rolled across the border. Within days, Afghanistan's president was dead in a coup backed by Moscow, and a new puppet leader, Babrak Karmal, was installed. The Soviets said they were there to protect socialism, but the reality was that Afghanistan had been the prize in a geopolitical tug-of-war, first between Britain and Tsarist Russia, and then later between Washington and Moscow, for over 100 years. By the late 70s, the Kremlin was scared that a shaky communist regime in Kabul would become pro-United States. Leonid Brezhnev's Brezhnev Doctrine had already justified crushing dissent in Czechoslovakia, and Afghanistan became the next test case. The result was a decade of guerrilla warfare. Afghan fighters, backed with money and weapons from the US and its allies, bled the Soviet army in mountain valleys and deserts. At least 1 million civilians died, along with over 100,000 soldiers, and Afghanistan became both a graveyard for the Soviet Empire and a launch point for the major conflicts that defined the post-Cold War world. 7. The War on Terror. The whole world watched when 9/11 happened. It was one of the most defining events of our era, and the fallout didn't just hit the US. It reshaped global politics. Scholars have even called the War on Terror endless because there's no clear enemy and no end date. It's meant decades of military occupations, like 20 years in Afghanistan, and new surveillance laws that chipped away at basic civil liberties. Airports, borders, and even the internet became part of a constant security struggle. Over time, it also evolved and led to the rise of ISIS, resulting in genocide, executions, and terror attacks worldwide. Washington has spent over $8 trillion chasing the fight, But for now, it seems as if the War on Terror has turned into a kind of open-ended framework. It flares up in waves, but it'll never conclude like a traditional war. 6. The Crusades. Say the Crusades, and most people think of Templars and castles. What they don't picture is 8 separate wars launched over 2 centuries where religion was the excuse, but the results were famine, massacres, and a rift between Christianity and Islam that refuses to die. The First Crusade alone saw whole Jewish communities in Europe wiped out before the armies even reached the Middle East. Once they did, cities like Jerusalem and Antioch were taken in bloodbaths, where civilians were killed in the thousands. Later crusades dragged on through sieges, failed invasions, and even the sack of Constantinople, when Christian armies looted one of their own capitals. The death toll is impossible to calculate, but millions were caught in the crossfire, and whole populations were wiped out. 5. Second Sudanese Civil War. Sudan has always been a country split in two. The north is Arab and Muslim, the south mostly black, African, and Christian. Add in oil fields on the border and decades of colonization, and you have the perfect recipe for war. In 1983, Sudan's president tore up the South's autonomy, imposed Sharia law nationwide, and claimed the oil for Khartoum. That lit the fuse. The Sudan People's Liberation Army rose up, led by John Garang, and the fighting that followed became the longest civil war in African history. Atrocities were committed on both sides. Child soldiers were forced into combat. Famine struck and millions died or were displaced. But at last, a peace deal was signed in 2005. The conflict ended with the map redrawn. South Sudan became its own country in 2011, but the population has never recovered. 4. French Wars of Religion. The French Wars of Religion began in 1562 when Catholic mobs attacked Protestants at Vassy. From there, France spiraled into anarchy. Nobles backed rival religions, mercenaries poured in from Spain and England, and ordinary people got caught in the carnage. The worst moment came when royal troops and mobs turned a royal wedding into a bloodbath at the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. Tens of thousands of Protestants were killed, and those who survived either fled or fought back. By the end, France's economy was devastated, and the monarchy could barely hold it together. So, they came up with a compromise, the Edict of Nantes in 1598, a reluctant truce that gives the Protestants limited rights, but also pushed waves of refugees abroad, reshaping places like Netherlands, England, and even Cape Town, South Africa. That's why they have such a strong French footprint with towns like Franschhoek, not to mention good wine. 3. The Spanish conquests of the Aztec and the Inca empires. When the Spanish marched on the Aztecs in 1519 and the Inca in 1532, they were ripping the heart out of civilizations that held tens of millions of people. Cortés leveled Tenochtitlan, Pizarro strangled Atahualpa, and both men shipped Europe's greatest treasure hauls home by the ton. The destruction was immediate, but the true killer was the diseases they brought with them. Smallpox, measles, and flu ripped through the Americas, wiping out up to 90% of indigenous populations. Whole cities became graveyards. It's even been discovered that the collapse destabilized the world's climate. Some scientists argue that the sudden depopulation left farmland abandoned, forests regrew, and CO2 levels dipped so sharply it may have helped trigger the Little Ice Age. 2. The Conquests of Menelik II. Before Menelik II, Ethiopia really wasn't what you would call a powerhouse. It was a patchwork of highland kingdoms, each pulling in its own direction. Menelik started out as the king of Shewa, but managed to come by modern rifles from Europe. By 1889, he had taken the throne as emperor. From there, he didn't waste any time. He pushed south and east, conquering Walaita, Kaffa, and Harar, and set up soldier colonies that grabbed land, collected taxes, and forced locals into service. On paper, the empire looked stronger than ever. Menelik even defeated Italy at the Battle of Adwa in 1896, but the conquests came at a horrific price. Villages were burned out, people were enslaved, and whole groups of people were forced to change language and religion. Add in the cattle plague and famine of the 1890s, and millions were dead. Unlike most of Africa, Ethiopia stayed independent, but that did not make it stable. 1. The Ethiopian Civil War. Since I'm on the topic of Ethiopia, let me finish today's list with their civil war. It's a fact that we can't lay all the blame for Ethiopia's ongoing famines and unrest at Menelik's feet. Their civil war began in 1974, when a group of Marxist officers calling themselves the Derg overthrew Emperor Haile Selassie. They promised land reform and equality, but instead rolled out a cruel dictatorship that wiped out all their rivals. The Soviets and the Cubans immediately saw an opportunity to gain a foothold in the area and decided to back them. That made Ethiopia one of the most heavily armed states in the region, even as its economy collapsed. On top of that, Eritrea, which had been forced into Ethiopia in the 50s, was fighting for independence, and northern groups like the Tigray rebels were battling the Derg at the same time. So it was literally a powder keg waiting to explode. Then, famine hit the country in the mid-80s, as we all know. I mean, the most famous picture of the era was seen everywhere in the world. And while the country did suffer from a drought, it was made worse by the war, forced relocations, and the government's corruption. By 1991, the rebels marched into Addis Ababa, Mengistu fled into exile, and Eritrea finally broke away as its own country. What Ethiopia proved, though, is that when ideology, famine, and foreign meddling collide, the result can be every bit as devastating as a world war. And that's a wrap. But I will leave you with this trivia question. After Germany invaded Poland in 1939, which countries were the first to step up and declare war? Was it A, the United States and Britain, B, France and Britain, C, Soviet Union and Italy, or D, Italy and France? Drop your answer in the comments below, and while you're at it, let me know if you'd like to see more content like this. And speaking of, if you thought wars nearly ending humanity were bad, well, wait until you see what our governments get up to. Our related video is 25 shocking facts that governments don't want you to know. From shady surveillance programs to scandals that were never meant to go public, it's one of those lists that'll kind of leave you looking over your shoulder. That link will show up any minute now, any second now, right about here. And as always, thank you guys so much for watching. Like, share, comment, subscribe, do all that fun stuff, and I'll catch you again next time. See ya.